Arabia, being in Damascus. I have a few photographs here. All right, so I'm just kind of, since we're talking about Damascus and Saul of Tarsus and some of that, you see this, that very top one there, it looks like the inside of some kind of Catholic monastery or something, you know. That is the traditional, and I stress traditional because sometimes these things, you know, they knew it was somewhere around there, and so somebody makes it that, and so who knows if this is the actual place. This is where it is believed to be Ananias' house. So this is where Paul would have come, inside this stone building there. That would have been his living room, and that's where Paul would have stayed blind for those days, was here in this room there. And so that's what it would. So it wasn't like a shack or anything. It's apparently a pretty big building, you know, at least for that time period, substantial looking home, which would mean that Ananias, perhaps the Lord called on him. Sometimes you think Ananias was just, you know, some straggler, but maybe he was one of the leaders in that community. You know, maybe the Lord called on him to do that. I don't know, but this is definitely not just a, you know, a tent or something. You know, I mean, this was a pretty substantial home for back then.
He was blind, wasn't he staying at someone else's house? Like,
yeah, this is.
And then Ananias came and
Well, yes, there's a street called Straight, which is where this house is here. So let's go to Acts. I think it's chapter 8, chapter 9. Okay. It says, now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and the Lord said to him in the vision, Ananias, and he said, here I am, Lord. He says, go to the street called Straight at the house of Judas, and look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying, and he has seen a vision of a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him, so that he might regain his sight. And then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, and how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. He has authority from the chief priest to bind him. But the Lord said, go. And then skip down a little bit. It says, Ananias departed, entered the house, and laying his hands on him, said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And it says he was strengthened, and then he stayed with the disciples at Damascus. So Ananias comes. This, from all of the things that I've been able to see, says this is Ananias' home. So I don't know if that's just a misnomer, and that they, you know, that this is Judas's home, that they're saying Ananias came to stay with them. So that's something I want to look up, because Ananias is the one that prays, but they call this Ananias' home. Could have been renting it, or maybe they're trying to say, maybe there's a tradition. That's something I need to look. Maybe there's a tradition that that when it says that Paul stayed then at Damascus with them, he was with Ananias then. So maybe this was not the home that he first went to, but maybe they're trying to say this is where he was once he connected with Ananias. So that's something I like to go back in and look. Right. Right. Yeah. And it says instantly, you know. And it's kind of interesting that, you know, that he's sick and God put it on somebody's heart to go all the way over there, and, you know, which is kind of neat. This valley that's there is kind of the valley that the road runs through. So they don't know exactly where Paul had his conversion, but it's probably somewhere in this valley, right, is where the road kind of runs through. And if you flip over to that other one, there's a couple of good pictures there, but it's a little hard to see. So if you look at that other one and you see the map, and if you go all the way to the left, it says to Tyre. See what these lines are? it's a kind of a topographical, the back side of that one, at the top. It's kind of a topographical map, and so those lines there are the old Roman roads. That because Rome came into Jerusalem and they built roads all the way through that area. And so when it says that he was on the road to Damascus, that was an official Roman road that was a pretty substantial, well-known road that they had built. And so you see this big line that's going west to east, the horizontal one, the only one that's really going horizontal, that's the road to Damascus. So that was a major road. And so that's why everybody, so it wasn't just like a path. This was like the road running through the country. And so you can see that this is very far north, right? If you look there on the left, it says Tel Dan, right? So that was from Dan to Beersheba, that was the northernmost limits of ancient Israel. So we're at the very top end, right? And then if you follow that east from Tel Dan, you come to a place called Banias, right? There's a bridge. It says the bridge, and then it says Banias. Mm-hmm. Banias is a more modern name for Caesarea Philippi. So where Peter confesses Jesus to be the Christ, that takes place there. And then if you go just keep following that same road, it takes you to Damascus. So that same road, now that I think about it, this is kind of interesting, in the same place, basically, same road, where Peter has his revelation of who Jesus is the same road where Paul has his revelation of who Jesus is. It's the same road. Who knows how close on the road, but it's the same road. Jesus says they were outside of Caesarea Philippi on the road, and he began to talk to them. And Paul here was on this same road right outside of that area, right between there and Damascus. So the same stretch of road, basically, within a mile or so, is where Peter has his "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God" revelation of Jesus. And then Paul gets on that same road and has his revelation too. So that's pretty neat.
So is that the road underneath?
Yeah, and so that is the road there. That's the actual road. And
so
yeah.
Was it just now read that you
Put that together, yeah. Because I'm thinking about it, that's where Peter had his revelation. I'm like, wait a minute, we're talking about Paul's revelation. So it's right there in that same spot.
That since the last two classes that we've taken, those cities really come alive when you're reading.
Yeah, yeah. The more you layer it in, the more you're able to do that, because you're thinking, well, wait a minute, I know the other stuff that happened there, and you're like, well, that's neat, But yeah, definitely putting, like I'm telling you guys in the other classes, the more you connect the maps with this stuff, it really does help, because it's just like there's a big difference between somebody that's never been to this city and I start talking to them about the Osceola Mall and iDrive and stuff like that versus somebody that lives here and you know where those are in relation to each other. It makes so much more sense. It really helps that to come alive. But that is the actual road. You can see some of the remaining stones. It was not a dirt road at the time. It was a paved road with big stones. And so that, yeah, larger, fairly large stones. So not like our pavers, like brick size, but large stones that they had made. So the Romans were very famous for that, for their roads. You get that saying, all roads lead to Rome, because that's how they did it. They literally were famous for their roads, and they had them all to where they would lead back to Rome. And then the second page there, that's part of that same field there, same area. But the bottom one there is the one I want you to see, because that's an actual bridge on the road right before you get to Caesarea Philippi. So Jesus and the disciples would have gone through that bridge to get to Caesarea Philippi. So that's kind of a neat thing, because right before Peter confesses Jesus is the Christ, when they're on their way to Caesarea Philippi, they would have gone through this. And it also goes to show you, sometimes we have an image in our mind of Jesus and then, just roughing it on back roads. But when you look at that map, you realize, wait a minute, they're on the main highway there, on the way to Caesarea Philippi. That was, they took the road, And then the other thing that I would say, I don't know if you know this, but Damascus, sometimes when we hear that, it just kind of in passing, we think, oh yeah, that's where Paul went and stayed. Damascus was one of the 10 largest cities in the Roman Empire. And so Damascus was huge. It was definitely the largest city anywhere around there, in the Israel-Syria area. In terms of, they were what they called 10 elite cities in the Roman Empire, and Damascus was one of them. It was very large, had all kinds of buildings and businesses and all kinds of roads and infrastructure. I mean, it was a very sophisticated town. So when Paul says he's going there to hunt Christians, sometimes we have in our minds this small little cubby of Christians. Basically what he's saying is I'm going to New York because I know there's going to be more of them there than there are in some of these small towns. So I'm going to hit them in the major areas where they could be, and we'll start there. So I'm going to make a splash. If I'm going to arrest Christians, let's do it in the biggest town. And so Paul gets the paperwork and says, I'm headed to Damascus. Right? So this would have been a very large city. Even today, the locals call it a little different than our Bibles translate it. They call it Sham. And so it was known quite a bit also in that world as the city of Sham. Also. From early times. And so Damascus is, from archaeological studies, we know Damascus is not only one of the largest cities that was there, it is one of the oldest. It was one of the original cities, perhaps even predating the flood. But can you think of anyone that might be associated with the flood that might have had something to do with building a city named Sham? Shem, yeah. That's what the tradition is that this is the city that Shem built and lived in, was Damascus.
So are you saying that's what it's called currently?
Yeah, a lot of people even today call it this. That's a name that's come down. And so that's a very traditional name for that city, is Sham. And so the tradition is that archaeologists say that this city was founded 6,000 years ago, which would make it actually predate the flood by several hundred years. So if it is, or so either it predated the flood, or they're just off a little bit on their carbon dating. But the tradition is that this is where Shem built, and that would explain why it was such a massive city. That this was one of the 3 sons that came off the ark. This was his hometown. This is the one that he founded, and so it would have got off to a big start. Because that would have been his centerpiece city there, right? And some people think him or one of his descendants, some people think was Melchizedek as well. That's another rumor that's out there. It's hard to know. But him being, because he would have been alive still during Abraham's time. And so some people think that for there to have been a king in that area, it would have had to have been one of the original. So if it wasn't Shem, it must have been one of the few that came directly after Shem. Which is interesting. All right, so how much time do we got? We got only a couple minutes. A lot that I want to talk about, but I don't know if we time to start into too many of them today. Maybe we'll just give some of the basic facts, right? So how did Paul get his name Paul? Because he wasn't always Paul. He started off as Saul, right? And so how did he get the name Paul? And then the other thing that's interesting, he is from the tribe of Benjamin. And there's another famous Saul of Benjamin, so that's why probably his parents chose that name.
Wasn't it something to do with the person that lived in the city whose name was also Paul?
Yeah, so here's the thing. We don't know, right? So there's 2 or 3 possibilities. One possibility is that this is his Roman interpretation of his name, right? And so that his name never changed, just depending on, where he's traveling. That when he started getting more into a Gentile ministry, he took on a more Roman version of his name, right? So that's possible. The other possibility that kind of, because a lot of times people think it was the conversion, right? That when he saw on the Damascus road that the Lord changed his name, but that's not true. It's not mentioned there at all. In fact, the changing of the name is not mentioned. It's just in Acts. They're calling him Saul, and then in the next chapter it goes to Paul. So there is no story that tells us why. The reason that some people think it could have something to do with the guy that was on the island is because when Paul gets to this island, the governor of the island's name is Paulus. And so Paul has this encounter with him, and the guy takes him in for a little bit and that kind of stuff. And after that, he's no longer referred to anymore as Saul. He's always referred to as Paul. So that's why people wonder, is there a connection with that? Because this guy named Paulus takes him in, and from then on out, he's only called Paul. So it's possible it had something to do with that. But other than that, we don't really know. Right, yeah. They have an accent, Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because a lot of times, most people, if you ask them that, the first thing that comes to their mind is, oh, well, God changed his name at the conversion. And I don't know where that came from. Yeah, because it's not in there anywhere, but so it's kind of interesting. But it is possible that it's just that Saul is a Hebrew version of the name, and so, traveling more in Gentile territory, it might have been more advantageous for him to go by his Roman name, because if you're a Roman citizen like he was, they had a lot more rights. So if you remember that story where they throw him in jail, and then he throws out the surprise, hey, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen, then all of a sudden and they say, well, I paid a lot of money for mine, and you're not rich. And he says, but I was born in Tarsus. And then they're like, oh, Tarsus, And so Paul had received his by birth. And so it's possible, though, that because of all the intense persecution that Paul endured, that he found it was easier in Gentile territory to associate, and maybe he felt like he could win more converts if he had a Roman name as opposed to a Hebrew name. All right, and then we didn't really do a devotional, but I can give you one. Go to Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy is a book that we'll be in and out of a lot for Paul's studies. This is one of the places where he quotes from the most, is Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy and Isaiah are the 2 places. So much of what Moses taught in Deuteronomy is the foundation of a lot of the things that Paul teaches. So what I'm going to do next week is I have several lessons, at least 2, that I've put together that look at the quotes that Paul pulls in from the Old Testament, because there's a lot of good stuff there. There's a lot of stuff that Paul's quoting that if you don't have a Bible that puts stuff in quotes, you would assume that's Paul's words. But a lot of what Paul teaches is based on, particularly a lot of his arguments in Galatians and Romans, is all Old Testament prophets that he's pulling in and then building cases off of what they said. And so that kind of goes back to the original thought of Paul is using the Old Testament to teach a few things. He teaches the life of the church. He teaches that the Gentiles are welcome. And he teaches that we are no longer under the law, and we'll talk about what that means. Probably don't have time. Yeah, that's a big subject. I won't get into that today. So we'll do that next. So that's where we're going to go with the discussions. Is I want to look at that because I think there's a lot of stuff that that we don't necessarily realize is Old Testament. And then when we realize it's Old Testament, we want to go back in and look at what the Old Testament message was, because a big part of how Paul uses the Old Testament, you need to know what that Old Testament writer's point was. And then, because Paul only takes like just a snippet of it out of that guy's whole maybe paragraph long point. And so when Paul takes the snippet, he's assuming that you know the world of the Bible like the people in his generation knew the Bible. I mean, they knew the Bible inside and out in these generations. And so Paul weaves a lot of stuff in there. And I mean, there's some entire paragraphs that you've probably heard quoted, and you just assume that's Paul. And all he's done is take a line from Psalms, a line from Deuteronomy, a line from Isaiah, a line from Hosea, a line from Habakkuk, and put it all together into one paragraph. Yeah. And yeah, exactly. And so you go through that and you're thinking, wow, that was pretty neat. And then if you look in the footnotes of your Bible, it's Psalms, Hosea, Habakkuk, and you're like, wait a minute, hold on. You know, and it's just, it's a lot of, yeah, I know, right? Something to compare it. And so this one, though, this particular one is just a devotional that I'll give you real quick. Deuteronomy 32:8. It says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, he divided mankind. He fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. So that's kind of an interesting thing. He says he fixed the borders of the people according to the numbers of the sons of God. And so what some people think he means by that is that the original kind of table of nations that's given has 70 nations, right? And when the Israelites came in to Egypt, there were 70 of them. And so then on the way back out, as Moses is singing his song, he's saying God ordered the nations according to the sons of God. And so kind of the tradition of what they think he's trying to say is there were 70 original nations in their world, and he's saying that God had a child of Israel, so to speak, that corresponded with each one of those. So that's just kind of an interesting thing that if you read through that, you may not even understand what he was trying to get at. But he says he fixed the borders of the people. So that's Gentiles, is what he's talking about. That's that word for Gentiles. He fixed the borders of the Gentiles according to the number of the sons of God. And so most of the time when you hear that number of the sons of God, he's talking about Israel. And so that's what they think he means by that, is that in that original table of nations in Genesis, there's 70 Gentile nations. And he's saying that when the Israelites went in, there were 70 of them. That becomes like a big number in the Bible. Jesus, when he sends out the disciples, there's 72 of them. So they kind of go back and forth. Some versions have like 70, some have 72, but it's designed to be that same thing. So there's something in that number 70 that was the number of nations, it was the number of original Israelites, and it was the number of disciples that Jesus sent out. And so the idea is that 70 always represented the totality of the nations. So when Jesus gets ready to send out his disciples, he gathers 70 of them and sends them out, almost as a representation of the different nations. So, all right.